Hi, everyone. I'm Michael Wayne. This is Voices for the Future with my co-host, NGO Judith.
Hello.
And yeah, we're very excited to have our guest for this program, Scott Santens, who's really a tireless and a very, to me, one of the foremost advocates for a universal basic income. So I'll read Scott's bio, just introduce him, and we'll really get into it and help people understand more about this really important topic. So as I said, Scott Santens is a leading advocate for a universal basic income. He's been acknowledged by Andrew Yang, who ran for president in 2020, as one of those who helped shape his thinking, and described by the historian Rutger Bregman as by far the most effective basic income activist out there. And Scott has lived with a crowd-funded basic income since 2015 and has been researching and advocating for a UBI around the world since 2013. He's currently the senior advisor for Humanity Forward and also serves on the board of directors of the Gerald Huff Fund for Humanity and as the editor of Basic Income Today, which is a daily UBI news hub. His debut book about UBI and how to pay for it is titled Let There Be Money, and you can buy it on Amazon or listen to it on your favorite podcast platform. We'll give links to Scott's website. And as Scott says, basic income is not left or right, it's forward. And yeah, so universal basic income really, in my mind, is an idea as time has come. It's been around. The ideas first floated 500 years ago. And in a moment, we'll talk about it, what it is, and go further in there. But Scott, as a matter of interest, personal interest, and so on, how exactly, what got you interested in this subject and to become such an advocate for it?
Yeah, thanks, Michael, for having me here today, and Adodeo too. And I got into this in 2013 through basically the same angle that a lot of people have gotten into it from, but it was before a lot of people were talking about it from the perspective of automation. And so this was it was a thread that hit the front page of Reddit with like thousands of comments, and people were talking about like just how quickly technology was advancing and how like no one was talking about it and like what that would lead to. And this was like before the Oxford report came out later that year, talking about how 47% of jobs could be automated within the next 20 years. And this thread was just like fascinating to me to learn more about these technological advances that like I didn't even know about. And I thought that I was following technology, at least not super closely, but closely enough. But I was just surprised with the stuff that was in there. And there was a recommendation for a book that was called Manna by Marshall Brain. It was a short fiction novel. And people just recommended that anyone interested in this should read that. So I did. And it really did paint like a really like crystal clear kind of picture of this kind of forked road that we were going towards, of this kind of dystopia versus utopia based on the same technology. Like we can actually choose to use this technology in a way that benefits everyone and really leads to like this much better world, or we can continue going like the way we're going and things will get like a lot worse. And so reading that and thinking about it, got me thinking more about the concept that the author didn't necessarily mention in the book, but the author did believe was the way to like get to the better um, ending of the book, let's say. And he was for basic income. And so I started looking it up, just really fascinated to learn about the pilots that had been done, like in the 70s, both in the US and Canada. The fact that we almost did like a version of it for families back under Nixon, and just the history of it philosophically over the years, like you pointed out, hundreds of years ago. Um, and just like this has this rich history and evidence base, and as being someone who is very evidence oriented, I was just really surprised that there was all this evidence already for multiple pilots, not only back in the 70s but even newer ones more recently. And then I also learned more about the details of like the existing welfare system, the conditional system that we're all so used to. And that combination of things just made me realize that this is an idea that isn't just like a good idea for automation, but it's a good idea like in general. It's something that we actually should have done, I feel, decades, if not even centuries ago. Um, and it's just realizing that I thought, well, this is such an important idea that I need to focus on this 100%. And that's what I've been doing since.
Wow. And I bet in the future, a lot of people will thank you for that. So I want to start about talking about jobs, because as we talk about the health of the economy, they're always saying, new jobs are created. We need to create more jobs, more jobs, more jobs. And yet that is part of the problem in many ways. It's part of pollution, certainly people commuting to their jobs. And you're saying that that's the wrong approach. So talk to us about that, because that's so much in the cultural thinking.
Yeah, I think like another book that I highly recommend people read is Bullshit Jobs by David Graeber.
Mhm.
And I think that he really hits on something as far as the this notion that what happens when we feel that work is so important that we're not even thinking about what it is that we're doing. It's just that we all have to like earn our right to live through this having a job of some kind. And so because of that, like an outcrop of that is just we ended up generating so many jobs that don't even need to exist, that people doing them feel that they don't even need to be doing them, that they have no value. And part of that too is just the economic impact, the ecological impacts of these jobs that don't need to exist. And of course, there's jobs that are good jobs that actually exist because of those jobs. So like as example he brings in the book is let's say you have like a building full of bullshit jobs that don't need to exist. And that office building needs like a janitorial staff and like those kind of things, like those are important jobs, but they only exist because these other unnecessary jobs exist. And yeah, so we get stuck on believing that just doing anything at all is required, like thou shalt not eat unless you do some kind of work. And as a result of that, there's just so much work that we don't need to do. There's so much harm that's done. There's so much sociological harm that's done too. There's not only ecological jobs, but people can go out there and just lie to other people and defraud people and just doing anything they can to get money to live. And and of course also people are completely disengaged in their jobs too, even if they have a job that's actually important. Maybe they're entirely underpaid. They're not interested in this because they just feel they have to do it. There's that's like those various comic strips where like panels, and then someone is like asking them like, why are you here today? And like the person will amusingly say something, well, I need money to live. So you can't actually say that in a job interview, but like that's the truth behind a lot of these jobs that people take. So we're
What
in this
percentage
situation.
would you say?
What's
What,
that?
what what percentage of jobs would you say come under the heading of bullshit jobs?
David Graeber estimated that it could be as high as like 30%. And as far as like disengagement goes, like globally, I believe it's like only 15% are engaged globally. In the US, 30% are engaged. So this is, most people are entirely disengaged by their work or just partially disengaged. But either way, like if we make sure that people actually can choose their work, like they actually are choosing, what is best for me. I have time to like find skills and train and seek the employers that's a good employer, the conditions that are good. Like if you actually give people that time, then they can find the work that's actually activates them and engages them, and they feel is socially important even. But in the situation that we have now, then there's just so many people doing unnecessary jobs. And it's also against automation too. Like if people feel that that it's good to like have a human doing a job, then like you have like unions fighting for jobs that don't need to exist just because they feel that people need to have the money and to have the job. So like we're even pushing against automation. And so that's even another thing where even when I first got into this, I'm thinking what happens when we automate a bunch of jobs. But also the flip side of that is, well, we actually want to automate as many jobs as we can. At least I feel that we should. No one should be forced to do a job that a machine can do or that is entirely unnecessary. Like both of those things, we should reorient around.
Yeah. So that brings to mind a quote from Buckminster Fuller about this whole bullshit jobs. He said, what he once said, "We keep inventing jobs because of this false idea that everybody has to be employed at some kind of drudgery because he must justify his right to exist. And David Graeber called them bullshit jobs. So it begs the question, what is the nature of work and what is our true nature? Are we supposed to spend most of our time working at a job, bullshit or not?
Yeah, I would like to think that our purpose or the purpose of work even is to to perform what needs to be done for all of society. That we're doing something, we are we're giving back to and contributing to the community, society as a whole. I feel that we all want to do that, and I think that where we've kind of gotten stuck on is thinking that we need to force people to do that. And so back in the day, we were more of an agricultural society. People needed to do a lot of farming and they would feed themselves and some of their community. But like we're looking at 60, 70, 80% of work was agriculture. And now agricultural work is as far as the production of the food itself is about like 1% of all our total collective effort. And instead, we're doing some things that we still all value. There's there's entertainment and there's poetry and there's there's so many things that we want to be doing. But also like we are kind of there's barriers to doing that. You aren't able to pursue these things unless you have like your basic needs met. I think a good way of looking at this is like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where if you just have your basics met of both food and shelter and also a sense of security, then you don't stop there. It's just you're more enabled to actually find what is it, how do you connect with your community, how do you build relationships with your family and friends in the community, and then how do you find that thing. The Japanese would define it as ikigai, as far as like that thing that you enjoy and the community wants that you can get paid for. But it's whatever that thing is, we all have that kind of like wanted to seek out that purpose. And I think that we kind of have created this world where we're trying to force people to find that purpose, and in doing so, we're actually preventing a lot of that from happening.
Mhm. So you've done some pilot studies, and there have been many pilot programs with UBI. Tell us about them and what the results were. What did they find?
Oh yeah. So like, there's so many things, and different pilots look at different things. But I would say like some of the pilots that really caught my eye, especially originally too. Um, there was like one of the first kind of like fully universal kind of pilots. So that this is where you take like a large community, and like the whole community gets it, instead of like trying to find certain people within like a city, which is what we're mostly seeing now. But in the Namibia pilot, this was a pilot for about a year of 1,000 people in one village, and everyone was provided this basic income of the adult got the each adult in a household got the amount, and then each child in the household got half the amount of the adults. And the things that really caught me was that overall crime reduced by 42%, and a specific crime uh, went down 95%, and that was actually illegal hunting.
Mm,
So I think that's really interesting, because it kind of shows too that there are forms of work that we really don't want to do, again, because they're somehow damaging to our environment or each other. And you can tell that that was kind of like a crime of desperation, where the only reason they're going out and killing, say, an endangered animal is because they have to feed their family. But as soon as that option no longer is there, it's like, oh, well, I don't need to kill an animal to feed my family, then it just drops.
mhm.
So that like the crime reduction, I think, was really caught my eye. Another one from the Namibia pilot was a jump in self-employment of by 301%. So this was like a quadrupling of entrepreneurship, where everyone just like wanted to start their own business. And you can see that's different too than a kind of traditional, let's say, a micro loan kind of situation, where you can find entrepreneurs or would be entrepreneurs and give them capital to start up a business. But is that business going to succeed if they're actually surrounded by people that can't afford to buy anything from them? So what's interesting about universal basic income is that not only does it actually help entrepreneurs start up a business, not only in the form of capital, but also in the form of reduced risk. So people feel, oh, well, I want to start up a business, but what if I fail? And what if that means that my family will starve? So I'm not going to take that risk. I'm just going to work for somebody else. Uh, but UBI actually reduces that risk. So you actually see more entrepreneurs that way too. And then when they create that business, they're surrounded by people who are customers, and they have money to spend. And so that's how you succeed. There's so many businesses out there, I feel, that had good ideas, that they were doing something positive for the community, but maybe their community just couldn't afford it because they weren't making enough, discretionary income to actually afford to be a customer at that business. So looking at it from that perspective, I think that it would be huge for entrepreneurship. And that's actually backed up by other pilots too, as is the crime one as well. So another one was India's UBI pilot. So this was another fully universal basic income pilot. These were across multiple villages this time. So I think it was in like 6 or 7 different villages, thousands of people across all the villages. And again, very large entrepreneurship effects. This was the villages that received the basic income had 3 times the entrepreneurism as the control villages. And yeah, you just see this over and over again. Another thing that I see frequently is improved birth weights of children, and this is due to better maternal nutrition. And that's like you see that a lot. That's in Alaska. It's in these various pilots. It's even in, programs that like the earned income tax credit and stuff like that. It's just, if you make sure that, pregnant women have more money and more food security, then their babies are going to be born healthier. And what does that mean? That has like downstream consequences. Like a healthier baby is going to be a healthier adult. And that's tied in also with like earning more and less crime. Even like there are just better outcomes for, babies who are born in like healthier environments. And another one from the crime one too. So I'm only talking about Namibia and India and stuff so far. So I know people think, oh, well, that can be a big deal like over in the developing countries, but what about like in developed countries like the US and stuff? But again, you see these in a lot, you see these here too. I like to point out to Alaska is this great example of a basic income that has existed for 40 years now. And it's a fully universal, unconditional, to all individuals, rich or poor, no work requirements. And every year, everyone in Alaska gets this payment that can be as large as, say, $3,000 per person. A household of 5 people, that's $15,000 that year of just unconditional cash in the form of this dividend. And so what has happened from that? Well, interestingly, too, you actually have seen more work. There was a study that looked at the impacts of this, and they found that there was no negative impact on full-time employment, and that part-time employment actually increased by 17%. So
because people could afford to have a part-time job because the rest was getting supplemented.
Yeah, that's kind of the theory, and also the fact that when people have more money to spend, then that creates more jobs. So then, maybe there wasn't a part-time job that existed, but then a bunch of people spend money and then a business needs to hire more workers. And then suddenly you can find that part-time job that didn't exist before.
So let's talk about the US, not to negate other countries. You talk about a lot about India, because it seems like the UBI is on an accelerated track now through the US, through like the organization Mayors for a Guaranteed Income. And it seems like it all started with Michael Tubbs. I don't know if that's where it all originated, but could you tell us about Michael Tubbs, him in Stockton as the mayor, and then what has happened since and what's going on in the US right now with the pilot programs?
Yeah. Yeah. So Stockton was the first of the kind of new generation of these experiments in the US. Again, there were experiments with a negative income tax variant back in the 70s. And a lot of people don't know about that, but those experiments happened in Gary, Indiana, New Jersey, rural North Carolina, Seattle, and Denver. Like there were a lot of different pilots, and they were testing various phase outs and different amounts too. And
Milton Friedman was a big proponent of it, the conservative economist. Yeah, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah. So again, this is very much a not left, not right kind of thing with Milton Friedman's support for this. And his logic too was, and this is true today, is that if you have a bunch of different conditional programs, then you can create like a marginal tax rate of up to 100% even, but they can be pretty high, even like 70-80%. And when I say marginal tax rate, I mean that when you agree to take a job, let's say you have welfare benefits, you agree to take a job, so like you gain $1 from the job, but then you lose, say, 70-80 cents per of your welfare benefits. So you end up only gaining like an additional 20-30 cents per dollar, which can mean it can work out to let's say you're effectively working for $1 or $2 an hour, in which case, why would you do that? So it makes perfect sense to not take a job if you're going to lose so much of the existing benefits that you have. So Milton Friedman looked at this and said, well, let's reduce that. Instead, we can just use the tax system. And if you fall below this, you get boosted up. and the withdrawal rate can be much lower. And then so nowadays we're not really looking at withdrawal rates. It's this kind of newer generation of experiments. We're just providing people with an unconditional floor and not looking at potential tax implications. But yeah, Michael Tubbs was the first to do that in Stockton. That was, I believe it was for 125 people, and it was for 2 years, and it was for $500 per month. And the results of that, again, very positive, especially the first year. The second year was in COVID. So it's hard also to draw specific conclusions from that when everything went haywire. But that first year pre-COVID, there was one particularly interesting impact I felt was that those who were recipients of the basic income were actually became employed at twice the rate of those who didn't receive the basic income. So again, that kind of pushes right back against this, oh, people won't work, when actually what happens is you are enabled to work. Like it's people say pull yourself up by your bootstraps, but it turns out that you need boots if you're going to even use that logic, and basic income buys the boots. You can't, you got to have money to make money, and that's what happens. Like you provided something, you have a floor, you have a foundation under you, and you're able to like seek out jobs. So one anecdote, one of the people from the Stockton pilot, the way this worked for them was that they were, I think they had a part-time job or a precarious job of some kind, and they were able to afford to like go to a job interview thanks to having a basic income. Like they wouldn't have been able to afford that; they'd have to take off work, but then you wouldn't be able to say meet rent that month if even you lost out on say $50 or whatever. So it really afforded him the ability to like go to that job interview and get that job and actually get a much better, higher wage, full-time job. And you can see too, like, imagine how many people are out there right now who, again, they can't afford to find a better job. They can't afford to find better work. And that's what it showed. Another interesting example too from Stockton was actually an impact on mental health. And they estimated that the positive impact on mental health was comparable and essentially equivalent to antidepressants. And yet, no medication involved, it just improved mental health. And that's another thing that you see over and over and over again in pilot after pilot, is improved mental health. In the Canadian pilot in Manitoba, hospitalization rates reduced by 8.5%. And it was largely seen to be this effect of improved mental health, reduced stress.
Yeah.
And that saves money on healthcare costs.
Exactly. And yeah, I make that point in my book where I talk about basic income as a foundation, where right now, without that foundation, we're treating so much of this. It was just treating the lack of basic income. So, the poverty, insecurity, these things, you end up spending so much more on, let's say, heart disease, cancer, all these different diseases that are largely impacted by stress and poverty. And it's just so much more expensive to do that. Right. Yeah. And crime too. Yeah. So much crime is done. I would say, there's kind of two different kinds of crime, mainly as far as like property crime, and also as far as like more violent crime. And property crime is more about like not having enough money, and violent crime is more about like social erosion due to insecurity and high inequality. And basic income actually combats all three of these things: poverty, insecurity, and inequality. So yeah, we would spend less on the criminal justice system, we'd spend less on healthcare, and also the money that we put into something like education would go further. So right now you've got kids who are going to school. Let's say they're going to school hungry. Let's say they have a very stressful household. They don't get to spend much time with their parents because their parents are busy just trying to scrape by. and they don't get much help from their parents because they're too busy, or the parents are fighting all the time. And so then with the basic income, you reduce that stress, you enable the parents to spend more time with their kids. They're able to go to school and not they're studying on full stomachs. And as a result of this too, you see that, you know, grades improve, that their educations go further. So that's an example of, it's not so much saving money in education, but it's making sure that the money we put in education actually results into far better outcomes.
And I think I remember from reading about Stockton that when people had the UBI, they went to more education. They said, oh, well, I can go back to school now, or I can take a course in something. And so they actually became better educated.
Yeah, that's a common thing. Another example of that is in the Delphin, Manitoba experiment in Canada, 1970s, and they found that graduation rates from high school actually exceeded 100%. And the reason that happened was because you had dropouts coming back to school and finishing their degrees. And so that's kind of an example too of when people say, "Oh, well, if you provide people with basic income, then they'll stop working."
Yeah.
And then they'll even look at, let's say, the number, and you look at like the whatever the drop was. I believe it was like let's see, like 3% in Delphin, Manitoba. And oh, see, people work less. And but the result, it's that people who dropped out of school in order to help their families survive, they were able to quit that job and go back to school. And of course, you know that that's going to most likely lead to better outcomes where they have earned more money lifelong, and they're able to help their family lifelong in a better way than they would have otherwise. So another example too, as far as schooling goes, is you see this, and this is a more recent U.S. This is like a natural experiment. This was the Eastern Cherokee dividend, started in the late 90s, and it's a great example because there was something going on called the Great Smoky Mountains Study of Youth, and they were studying kids growing up in poverty. And so they were starting to do that, and they were planning to do this like long, like 10-year long experiment of just seeing, just observing kids growing up in poverty and to see, where they ended up. And at some point along the way, a few years after that started, a significant percentage of those kids whose parents were in the East Cherokee Nation started receiving these dividends that were, they started around, say, $4,000 per year. Now it's grown over time to about like $12,000 a year. But these kids that started receiving that basic income, you just see lots of different positive impacts throughout their lives. Even to this day, you're still seeing positive impacts from that each time they kind of look at something else. Like one of those examples of something else more recently is they found that those kids who grew up with that basic income actually vote in larger amounts than the kids who didn't. So that's kind of like this democratic impact that you wouldn't, usually see. And you couldn't really design that experiment otherwise. It just, naturally kind of happened. It was just the luck of this happening. And again, like the kids had better grades. They had better student outcomes. They went further in school. And they also calculated that the money that went out as those dividends actually exceeded, actually was less than the cost of what would have spent otherwise on like the cost of crime, health, and these things. So that's even like an observed phenomenon, not just theoretical, but it's an observed thing as far as actually being cheaper to actually just make sure people have money.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So Scott, your book, the full title is "Let There Be Money: Understanding Modern Monetary Theory and Basic Income." So that's you and a lot of the book discusses the whole concept of modern monetary theory, because ultimately anybody who thinks this is a great idea or criticizes say, well, how are you going to pay for it? And so we want to talk about that. And there was one quote from your book, among many. It goes, we have to stop thinking about what something costs at the federal level. If it's important and we can do it, then we should do it, and then manage the economy around that, around us, because that's the entire point of the economy to work for us, to be basically a human-centered economy. So what's the importance of tying in this idea, this theory that Stephanie Kelton, writing the book, The Deficit Myth, modern monetary theory, the importance of tying it in with universal basic income? And as you say in your book, you need the modern monetary theory to make universal basic income work.
Yeah, I feel it's very helpful to understand the economy in terms of real resources in real terms. People, even this is the question, like, can we afford it? Do we have enough money? Where does the money come from? Like, it's like asking, do we have enough points? Where do the points come from? And like, when you ask that question, you think, well, points are a human made thing. It's not like you go out into a forest and pick up points. It's like we invented that. What do these things measure? And that's the question that we should be asking. The question is not, do we have enough money to make sure that people can afford to eat? The question is like, do we have enough food for everybody? And of course we do. Like, we actually waste 40% of our food supply on an annual basis. And, we have plenty of food in stores, but then people go to food banks in order to get the food. And we saw that, that was a stark thing during the pandemic, where you saw like miles long lines of cars in a middle of a pandemic, waiting for hours to pick up food. And you also had people just actually in physical lines standing for food in a pandemic. And the question should have been, is there enough food? And yeah. And so there are even places like the Chelsea Eats program. And this was something that started during the pandemic, where they actually looked at these people who were standing in line in a pandemic and thinking, well, maybe we should just give them money. So that's what they did. They decided to just do like a debit card system. And instead of forcing people to stand in lines to get food and potentially get infected with COVID or infect other people with COVID, they could actually even just order food or have food delivered, or go on their terms to wherever to get that food. And that program actually worked really well. There's actually a documentary that just came out recently called Raising the Floor that actually looks at that program. But yeah, so to get back to thinking about the actual resources and stuff, like another example, that this isn't from my book, but I think it's a good example. This is an episode of South Park where it was the Pinewood Derby episode, where like an alien comes down to South Park, and they end up like killing the alien, and the alien ship is like full of these space bucks. It's like these blue glowing like dollars, and they distribute those space bucks like around the world. Like, everyone feels that they all deserve like their share of space bucks. And like some countries end up like building a whole bunch of stuff. Like, I think Mexico builds like a bunch of like water slides or something. But I thought that was really funny how, it's not like the earth got more resources. It's not like it got more wood and metal and workers and technology. They just felt richer, so then like built more stuff. So I think that's and then the reverse of that was in the Depression, where like we had just as many resources as we had before the Depression, but like all this economic activity had stalled. It's like we didn't have any work anymore, when there was nothing stopping us from it. It was like a breakdown in our money supply, this system that we use. It was like Alan Watts described this as like people showed up to work and they were told, sorry, we're all out of inches. And doesn't make any sense. So yeah, when it comes to like what actually that we can do, what matters is, what are our resources, what are our natural resources, what are the people, what are their skills, what's the knowledge, um, what can we actually accomplish? And if you understand that, then you can actually go about basic income in a way that can manage inflation better, because then you're not wondering, okay, I have to tax a certain amount of money and then we spend that money here and then there's no inflation because it's the same amount of money. Like, that's not how it works. What works is you just create the money. Like, all federal spending is just money invented out of nothing, and then taxation actually pulls that money out and essentially deletes it. Um, and then looking at it that way, then the question is, well, how do we manage inflation? Like, how do you make sure that we don't exceed our economic capacity, as in demand exceeding supply? So if you want to make sure that, let's say, healthcare is affordable, the kind of typical response would be, well, we have to make sure that we tax people enough, and then we can do universal healthcare. And that's like a really empty way of looking at it. Instead, it's, well, we want to make sure that everyone can afford care. So then how do you make care affordable? So that means we have to have more doctors, more nurses, that, like, doctors can work remotely from here and reach people in this more remote area. How do we actually control costs so that, there's not um, someone doing like 1000x markups on medicine, just because they have some kind of predatory ability via intellectual property. And there's when you start looking at how do we actually do things like in a way that's affordable, how do we expand supply, like, that's how you actually manage inflation. And as long as you're just thinking in the traditional terms, then you're not going to really accomplish that.
So you're saying UBI actually reduces inflation, just to, boil it down to simplicity here.
It can. This is so one example of this. This is again from the India UBI pilot. People would say, "Oh, well, if you give everyone money, then food's going to cost more," and that's kind of this knee-jerk reaction. But in the India UBI pilot, when all these people had this money to spend on food, then there was a reason to actually start up businesses and to bring in food, to create that food. And so the supply increased to the point that the price went down.
Yeah.
And so prices actually went down thanks to that increased demand. So that's like one of those things that people kind of find it hard to think of, because they think of this from a static perspective, as in, the supply is 10. And if you give people 20 amount of money, then suddenly you've exceeded that. So then prices have to go up. But what people don't think about is that if there's so much more demand, then there's a lot more reason to invest to meet that demand, because people want to earn that money. And if you do that, then you actually can lower prices. The effect is also like kind of observed in Alaska every year when the dividend checks go out, and you have like businesses doing dividend sales. So they'll actually lower their prices to encourage people, to buy from them. And that's more of a competitive kind of thing. But the fact remains that yeah, strong demand equals strong supply, and that can lower prices. I would argue that one of the reasons we actually are seeing the inflation that we're seeing right now is because of the decades of stagnant wages that led up to this. So if you actually look at where expected GDP was based on like measurements from, let's say, the 90s, the 2000s, it expected us to have higher GDP. But how are you going to get that higher GDP if people have stagnant wages? So demand went down for certain things, and if demand goes down, then there's no reason for manufacturers to invest in that capacity to meet that. They'll lower demand. So we were in a situation where, let's say, again, just using some random numbers, let's say our supply capacity was at like 80, thanks to like decades of stagnant wages, and it would have been at 100. And so if we were at 100 in capacity, then we wouldn't have surpassed supply for various certain goods, and we would have seen less inflation. So yeah, it's a really good idea to make sure that you can produce as much as you can that your society actually wants and can achieve. And we haven't been doing that. Instead, we've had a massively unequal society where demand has been further concentrated at the top, and that's kind of really twisted what our businesses actually create supply for.
Yeah, and then speaking about inflation, you heard certain segment of the political spectrum, economic political spectrum, blaming inflation on all that money we gave out during COVID, the checks, the increased child tax credits, and it was just a horrible thing to blame those who really could use the money, that they were the ones jacking up prices, while meanwhile the whole era of quantitative easing and tens of trillions of dollars was given to the upper levels. And actually there was no inflation then, but no one, the same people blaming, oh, the free money we gave out to all those who don't want to work or didn't need the money drove inflation, but no one said anything. Those same people didn't say anything about the era of quantitative easing.
Yeah. I think one of the reasons why we saw the inflation that we saw is because we stuck with quantitative easing for so long and avoided quantitative tightening as long as we did. And so, part of that is you're pumping up the market. People with the pumped up market are able to afford, and even it makes sense to go out and buy more housing. So I think that was one of the impacts from all that pumping into the markets was that contributed to the increased housing costs. And when it came to it's really sad to see people blame the child tax credit at all for inflation. I mean, this was, first of all, it's going to kids. It went to over 90% of our nation's kids, and went to about, I believe it was maybe 36 million households. And the estimate of the inflation that led to, whether it was like 0.1% of the the 9% peak. And so instead it would have really helped families handle inflation. It would have really helped with this cost of living crisis from higher inflation, and it absolutely did not significantly just contribute to it at all. And if we really cared about reducing inflation too, when we did the stimulus checks and worried about, oh, what's that going to cause down the line, we could have just raised, we could have had windfall taxes on corporations, and windfall taxes that were set at, let's say, looking at the average of a corporation's profit margins for the past 5 years or something pre-COVID, and you would say, oh well, you want to discourage people from jacking up their prices to enjoy windfall profits and contribute to inflation, and we didn't do that. And also from that perspective too, it's not so much that you're coming up with money, again, because we just created the money for these programs, and but it's really about the incentive difference. If you say to a corporation, there's no reason for you to go for record 100% profit margins or something. We know that you usually get an average of 10% is your profit margin. So what we could have done is said, look, if you go beyond a 15 or 20% profit margin, then we're going to tax 100% of that revenue that you get. And that would have been a good reason for people not to jack up their prices, because they just would have had it taxed away. And we didn't do that. So yeah, there's things that we could have done, especially thinking from this incentive changing perspective and not from a money raising perspective, that really would have helped decrease inflation.
There's a quote from your book. Michael sent me some quotes before the talk. I haven't read it, I have to admit, but where you say can we also, as we design an optimal UBI implementation, can we also reduce or even eliminate income taxes as part of that approach by instead leaning on a mix of other taxes, the tax stuff we want less of?
Yeah.
Can we change the way people look at money, taxes, and government itself to something more visionary and less divisive?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so again, when you get out of this paradigm of taxes as like a fundraising kind of thing that enables government spending, then you're able to see it as what it actually does. And so what it does is pulls money out of the supply and essentially deletes it. So that helps manage the overall amount of money. But then when you see that too, you're thinking, well, what are the best ways of doing that? What are the impacts on human behavior of certain taxes compared to other taxes? So when you look at an income tax, that's one of those examples where, well, you're essentially disincentivizing something that we want, which is people earning income, people working to earn that income. And if the amount gets too large, then you start to see people, decide, well, I'm not going to do that. So you want to make sure that if you're going to do income tax, it's like a low enough rate that you don't really impact that. And then, yeah, so what other options are there? Milton Friedman, his favorite was land value taxes. And I really like that too. That's kind of Henry George's, his take on taxing the unimproved value of land. The unimproved value of land is, the land itself and not what's built on it. So you can imagine like a skyscraper in New York City next to a parking lot. Right now, we tax property. And so the skyscraper is going to be taxed a lot more than the parking lot. A land value tax says, well, you should tax both of them equally. And so you're actually incentivizing people to build on this unused vacant land. And that would actually cut down speculation too. Like, again, I'm from New Orleans, and especially post Katrina, you saw people, you saw these houses that were just sitting there vacant and destroyed. And these owners were just sitting on it. And then like everything came back, and thanks to everyone else putting in their money and building it in the community rebuilding. And then suddenly someone sells and they get like a massive windfall, and they didn't do anything. They just sat on this land. And that actually helps increase rents too. So we want to like create an incentive where you don't hold on to empty land. You instead actually build housing, and it actually makes more sense to build up more housing. So it makes more sense to have, an apartment building for, 100 people versus, a single family dwelling taking up the same space. So like those kind of incentives, I think make sense. Another one I love, any kind of Bogovian tax. A Bogovian tax is a kind of tax that actually tries to take in externalities, an externality being a cost that those outside of that actually bear. So an example is a carbon tax I really like. So the externality is that fuel is a lot cheaper than it should be. Let's say it's whatever, $3 a gallon, where it technically should be $6, $7, $8 a gallon or something. Because the people who buy it and the people who make it, they're not paying for the impacts of global warming. They're not paying for the impacts of asthma. And if those were actually calculated into the cost and people had to pay that cost, then then you're looking at, well, should I have an oil, a fuel-based car? Should I have like an electric car? Well, the electric car suddenly makes a lot more sense when you're looking at $8 per gallon gas versus $3 per gallon gas. So pricing in those externalities makes a lot of sense. Carbon tax for that reason, I think, makes a lot of sense. But then there's also things, like sugar taxes. Like that's the kind of thing extremely unpopular, because all you're doing is essentially adding a tax to especially low-income people, especially when sugary stuff is cheaper and more prevalent and easier to get, let's say. But if you make sure people have money, then they can actually make better choices. They can choose whether they want, the cheaper sugary stuff, or they can choose the healthier stuff. And again, in basic income experiments, another one of those impacts is you see people choose to actually buy more fresh fruits and vegetables. So it's actually, again, when you trust people, they do make those decisions that that we actually want and feel is healthier, if they just can. So that's another one. And then also like a transaction tax. So this would be something, it's just a small tax on every transaction, make it very negligible, like 0.1% or something. And so if you just take that small amount out of everything, that helps manage the money supply in a way that is so small it doesn't really impact behavior. And as a result of that too, if it's a consumption tax, then those who are consuming a lot end up being net payers into the tax. And then those who aren't consuming that much, they actually are net recipients of the UBI. So a lot of these taxes that don't make as much sense and are seen as regressive actually suddenly make a lot more sense paired with the UBI and with the net outcome being progressive.
Mhm. And it starts with the foundational idea that it's not taxes that pay for things, that this whole pay for that the Congress does with everything. If we're going to allot this amount of money, how are we going to pay for it?
Yeah, kind of like a mental image that I think of is imagine like a big hole in the ground, really big hole in the ground, and like one way of filling it up is like one shovel worth of dirt at a time, let's say. And that's kind of like traditional thinking, where you're thinking, all right, well, we're going to need 1,000 shovelfuls of dirt. Where we find those shovelfuls? And it's just like trying to calculate that out. And it's just so much easier to just like get a backhoe and just like dump like a whole ton of stuff into it, and you get like yourself a mound. And then the question is, well, how do we get rid of the excess? What's the easiest way? And you can just like bulldoze it out of the way, or you can, figure out how to just get some shovel at a time. But regardless, what you're doing is subtracting instead of trying to do things one bit at a time. And when you do that, that's kind of more of like an abundance perspective of saying like, well, there's no shortage of money. Let's just make sure that you get the money there. And then the question is, what are the best ways to reduce that amount of money that you've put out there, because you're acknowledging real resources, real economic capacity.
One of the things people often wonder about, and I myself wonder about, when you talk about universal basic income, everybody gets some, regardless of whether they have a job that pays well or don't. And some people argue that shouldn't it just go to the underserved, to the people that need it? Another 1,000 a month doesn't make much difference to some people. It makes a lot of difference to other people. So what's the argument about that?
Yeah, I think that that people need to understand that as soon as you attach a test to something, then people are going to fail that test.
Mm.
And that happens especially among those with the most marginalized, the least incomes, essentially the hardest to help. Universality ensures that you reach everybody. Like you need to reduce those barriers as low as possible. It should be absolutely as easy to get as you can in order to make sure that all of the poor actually receive it. So if you don't worry about, the Bill Gates, the Elon Musk's, getting this, then by doing that, you make sure that everyone at the bottom gets it. So this is really bad. And this is what this is one of those details I learned at the very beginning that really kind of shocked me, was how bad our existing programs are at reaching people. Like, so program after program.
In the welfare system.
Right. So, let's say our best program is our food stamp, otherwise known as SNAP program that reaches about 3 out of 4 people in poverty. So our best program excludes 1 out of 4 people in poverty. And then a lot of programs, like one of our worst ones is TANF, and that's our temporary assistance for needy families. It's our only cash welfare program. It's what Bill Clinton did with his welfare reform. And that became block grants for states. So there's a lot of variability between states because it's no longer like a federal program that's determined at the federal level. And again, I'm from Louisiana, so I know that in Louisiana, the rate was as low as 4 families in poverty out of 100 families in poverty actually received that assistance. So you're talking about like a 96% exclusion rate. And on average across the country, it's around 23%. So most people, again, do not get this. If they do get it, it's very temporary and they lose it for all kinds of reasons, but it does not reach people. Same thing with housing assistance. That's 1 out of every 4 people who qualify actually get that assistance. And that assistance can take, 10 years or more to even get, like large waiting lists. You look at disability, 1 out of 5 people with a disability in America actually gets disability assistance. And that process can, on average, take years in order to get. And these programs are just, they're full of holes. It's this it's appropriate to think of it as a safety net where, the holes are so big that people are falling through it all the time.
Plus, it costs money to create the infrastructure for the social workers to keep track of the paperwork for the welfare recipients and all that. That costs a lot.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's so much paternalism involved, and there's so much money going towards not only like social workers that's unnecessary that could just be going to people, but then of course you have like this whole like nonprofit infrastructure that's been developed around that too, where so many people earn their incomes through the nonprofits in order to get charity to people. And, all of it is just, the money should be going to the people who need it, but it can't because of all these different conditions and tests and everything. And universality gets around that. It just says, look, this is essentially a human right. And as a human right, you deserve this if you're earning nothing. And you also deserve it if you're earning, $10 million a year. And, the best way to handle that, again, is through this method of subtraction. If you instead of trying to avoid getting money to Bill Gates, then you just make sure that he gets it too, which is, $12,000, which is piddly to him. And then you just make sure that his taxes go up more than $12,000, in which case he becomes a net payer. His income does not go up. He does not benefit financially from the basic income because the taxes are greater than what he receives. And that's actually how you make a stronger system too, because Bill Gates, even though he becomes a net payer, he still sees this as his like program. He's receiving something, he's included in this. And I think a lot of the problem, they say that poor programs or programs for the poor make for poor programs because, if you're a richer person, you're a higher income person, you see yourself as never needing these programs. They're not for you. All they're doing is you're paying into it and you're seeing no benefit. But if a universal program, then you benefit from that too. Like imagine if we means tested public education. So let's say a rich person couldn't send their kids to school, even though they mostly are going to use private schools anyways, but you actually said, no, you can't even send your kids to school because you earn too much. Well, then they're going to not actually defend public schooling at all because they don't even benefit at all. And the same thing with universal health care. Like if you make sure that everyone benefits from that, they're all requiring and benefiting from this program, they're going to make sure and defend it more than we're seeing with these tightly targeted kind of programs. And then one other thing too that I think is important for universality as well is it's right there. Look at the margins where someone barely qualifies or barely doesn't qualify. And the impacts of that, I think we're seeing as well. And what I mean by that is there's a study in Indonesia that looked at a cash program, and they looked at both sides of this line, and they saw that if you feel that you are in need of help and that you need assistance, and that you get this assistance from the government, then your trust in government goes up, say, 1 point. And if you are right on the other side of that line, so you feel that you need help just like the other person, but you're ignored because the government has determined that you don't need help, then your distrust in the government goes up 10 points.
Mhm.
So it is extremely damaging, I would say, to social cohesion, trust in institutions, to actually be excluding people that feel that they need some kind of help in some way, and instead that they feel that they're being ignored and those other people are getting help.
Mhm. Mhm.
That this discussion, what you were just saying, Scott, is really so important, goes to the heart of the whole idea of universal basic income. And it reminds me of the writer Annie Lowry's book. Annie Lowry writes for The Atlantic, wrote a book a few years ago, Give People Money. And the basic thesis of the book was just give people the money, no means, and by giving the people the money and having the autonomy, allowing them the autonomy of how they live their life and what they do with the money, just empowers them and empowers society. So, that's, just what you were saying about means tested versus unconditional universal basic income.
Yeah, Annie Lowry actually has coined another term that she's written about, that she calls the time tax. And this is looking at like this bureaucracy involved in, the existing conditional programs where, this stuff can be very complicated and it can require a lot of time. So isn't it interesting that, let's say, the people that most need the help, we put them through, just hoop jumping regimes where it requires, hours upon hours upon hours of paperwork and needing to travel to here or there to qualify for this or that. This is like, subtracting people's time from their lives. And then, we look at someone who's rich or whatever, and you have these programs that are, they're called tax expenditures, they're tax subsidies, they're tax cuts, but it's very much a benefit for the middle class and rich. And there's, nothing extra for them. They're just like, it's super easy. They just make it as easy as possible, and they get to keep more of their money. And it's, what's the difference between reducing someone's taxes by $100 or giving them $100? Either way, they end up with an extra $100. But we make the poor people, jump through so many hoops, and they don't get this help. But also, it subtracts time from their lives, and then we treat out someone else very differently because they just happen to have higher income.
Yeah, and that goes to the argument for some against universal basic income, in that, if we just give those people, or people in general, the money, they're going to spend it on booze and cigarettes and phones and buying lottery tickets. They're not going to put it to good use. Why? And they don't work. Why should we give them anything?
Yeah, the drug one, I think, is really funny. How first of all, like the evidence shows that there's actually studies of dozens of unconditional cash programs, and the evidence shows that expenditures on drugs and alcohol and these kind of temptation goods actually go down. So I see this as a lot of this behavior is very much like self-medication. If you're living a very stressful life, and you don't see a light in the tunnel kind of situation, it's going to make a lot more sense to abuse drugs, because that's makes life livable if you can kind of fade out from your life a bit. And the evidence shows that it actually helps people. But the funny thing about this is that I just, let's say when Wall Street distributes a bunch of bonuses, I just don't see anyone up in arms about the dangers of Wall Street people using their bonuses to buy cocaine. It's totally fine for people to buy like $1,000 bottle of wine, to enjoy cocktails out. Like nobody judges people for making those decisions. It's very common to just enjoy a glass of wine here and there. But for the poor, no, you can't spend your money on any of that stuff. Like that's a bad use of your money. So we're definitely have two different measuring sticks. again, for people just based on, the amount of income that they have. It's like we judge people as being less than for having low income. They don't make good decisions, and they're not going to make good decisions, even though the evidence says that that's not the case at all. That we all, for the most part, agree that we want certain things, that we need certain things, and then if we have money, we buy certain things, and there's a whole lot of similarity across the board. But yeah, we judge people differently.
And by the same token, people say, oh, we shouldn't, don't have the money to give poor people money, but we can bail out the banks.
Mhm.
Yeah, always.
We have so many questions. We could talk to you for a long time, but I'm thinking our listeners might have some questions too. So if you have any questions that you want to ask Scott, you can type it into the Q&A, or you can type it into the chat, and we will read them off and ask them. And I'm sure you do, as if you've been listening.
Yeah.
You had another site, a Reddit site, that listed all these benefits of climate change, and too many to list, but one that, not climate change, of UBI, one of the benefits that I didn't see on there that seems to me pretty obvious is it would really cut down on pollution. I look out my window and I see this highway that starts lighting up at 4:30 in the morning of people commuting to work every day to jobs that probably they hate, contributing to greenhouse gases. And if they didn't have to go to those jobs, that would make a big difference.
Yeah, I would argue that basic income is key to making a more sustainable world, and part of that again is like the David Graeber's bullshit jobs argument of just how many jobs don't need to exist at all. Part of this is we're even seeing this kind of difference between working in the office or work from home, and if we wanted to like actually focus on the environment, then we would say, well, we actually want people to work from home. If they can, because of that impact on the environment. But then there's also some kind of economic arguments that we can make that I think is good. One of them is this idea of inferior goods. So an inferior good is an economic term for a good that people only have a demand for if their income is like low enough. So imagine shopping at Walmart, and you need some shoes, so you buy like the absolute cheapest shoe that you can find because you can't really afford anything more. So let's say that shoe costs let's say $10, and let's say you have to buy like a new pair of shoes like every year.
They don't last.
Right. So after 10 years you spent like $100, and whereas someone who could afford better shoe, they could have spent like $50, $60, $70 or something, and maybe that shoe will last 15 years, 20 years, whatever. But those kind of goods, like there's a lot of things like that. Like there was a couch that I bought once from Walmart that was very, very cheap, and it was just it was shocking how quickly that thing fell apart. But then like a couch that we bought that was a little bit nicer, but not like crazy nice, but nicer, was just lasted, just it was great. So yeah, there's this, it's just true to say that it's expensive to be poor, that there's just you have to spend so much more money on these things so much more often because they're breaking down. And then from an environmental perspective, like it just doesn't make any sense. Like we should want things to be very lasting and sustainable, and only create something new if we need to. But instead we have this very disposable kind of culture. And I think part of it is because of this kind of lack of income and security that basically can help with. Another thing, and this is something again that was from was an unconditional cash program, and I believe this was in Indonesia. But this was a lot of people there received this unconditional cash on a regular basis for a while. It was kind of like a basic income in that way, and an unexpected result of that was that deforestation dropped by 30%.
Wow.
So again, that's like like with the illegal hunting, this was like a way of earning money that people didn't want to do. They didn't want to chop down the rainforest, but they needed to in order to feed their families. But as soon as you make sure that they no longer need to do that, then you see this drop. It's like people know that they don't want to be doing that and they shouldn't be doing that, but they feel they have to. So there's just so many jobs out there like that, I feel, that people know are ecologically harmful, that are either unnecessary or socially harmful, that they would not do, and we don't need to be done. There are other things we could do, or it doesn't need to be done at all.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah. So I want to give an example from Europe. My son's been living in Switzerland for a few years, where he goes to school, and his girlfriend is Austrian, and she's moving in with him soon. But she lives in Austria, grew up in Austria. Her family receives, I think they have two kids, the girlfriend and a sibling. They receive about 300, the parents receive 300 euros a month per child. And then when his girlfriend, who's now in college and was in Austria, she's going to go in Switzerland, but she was getting the money while in college. Along with that, the college is free or very low cost. So, that's what, at least in Austria, I don't know how other European countries are doing it, seems so sane, low cost, free college, and also receiving money to help go to college.
Yeah, it's interesting to look at all these various programs that exist that are, providing money to people for whatever reason that's for the most part unconditional. Like there are some qualifications, like maybe it's a student stipend, maybe it's a senior pension, maybe it's a child allowance. But if you look at those, like the impacts are positive. They are, when it comes to students, it's an investment in their future. When it comes to children, it's an investment in their future. Especially when it comes to children, like it's ridiculous the amount of money that we spend not investing in our kids. So the cost of child poverty in the U.S. exceeds $1 trillion a year, and we just reduced that by 40% with the enhanced child tax credit for 6 months, and the cost of that would have been an additional $100 billion per year. So like the math does not work out to just like say it's too expensive when we're actually fine with spending just trillions of dollars a year on the downstream costs of these things, instead of just making sure that we invest in people in advance. And I think that, that's how we should be seeing this is basic income is an investment in the entire community, in the nation at large, in every single individual. And when you actually make that investment, then there's huge returns on that.
Oh, yeah, without a doubt. So we're probably nearing the end, Scott. This has been great, and perhaps we can have you on again at some point because there's so much to talk about. But you're involved in a project, film docuseries project. I know you said it's not public yet, but whatever you could say about it. And also, there was a film that you had posted on Twitter that was at the Tribeca Film Festival. I guess we'll go wider soon, a documentary called It's Basic. So I just want to talk about that, but also about your project, what you're involved in with that media.
Yeah. So Bootstraps is public. It's not out yet. And so this is Bootstraps was built on a pilot was done by a couple friends of mine who are colleagues in the UBI space. They did this. They provided a basic income of $1,000 per month and $333 per month per kid for 21 people in 10 households across the country. And they did it for 2.5 years. It ended in like mid 2020, late 2020. So this is actually, there's some time there when people are going through the pandemic too with their basic incomes. There's thousands of hours of footage. The goal is to create a docuseries where there's a full season, let's say on Netflix or HBO or Hulu or something, of 10 1-hour episodes observing like what it is to actually have a basic income, how that impacts these people's lives, and they actually even see what their lives were like beforehand too. And I'm really excited about making sure that that film actually is fully completed, and that it's able to find a platform somewhere. So that's what I'm helping with right now. And there's also another project I'm really excited about too, called Commingle. People can go to the website called commingle.us and get on like the waiting list. This is a project that's in the early beta phase right now, where people will be able to join a community where they contribute to and benefit from a universal basic income. So this would be based on, say, an automated 7% fee on deposits to people's bank accounts. So then everyone pays essentially a 7% flat tax on income, and then everyone receives the same benefit on a weekly basis. So you can imagine, if you have a bad week and you earn $0, then let's say the average is $50 that you get for that week. And then if you're someone in the middle, it's more of an income smoother. So let's say you pay in $200 that month based on your income, and you receive $50 per week. So like there's no net benefit there, but you do see this income smoothing. So that will really help people who receive irregular incomes. Maybe you get paid every couple months or here and there because you have some kind of unstable contract or something. So I think that will immediately help people's security. And then at the upper end, you'll have net recipients paying in more than they get from the basic income. And those people will know that they're actually directly helping people in the community in a very direct and universal way. I would love to have that option, so I really look forward to make sure that is launched, where let's say instead of like going to like a GoFundMe where you expect people to like tell their story and you pick out your story and you say like, oh, that person is worthy, and this at a very individual basis, this would actually make it so in a small degree you could donate $100 or something to like hundreds of thousands or 1 million people, if that many people are part of the community. So I'm really excited about that being like a real actual small basic income that can happen right now, that everyone can be a part of, that people would really gain an understanding and know that even though everybody gets the same thing, those with the least are going to benefit the most, and those with the most will not be net recipients, but they'll know that they're helping the entire community, and if they ever need it, they'll get the help too.
That's great. Yeah, so more power to all these things, and moving us from dystopia to utopia, or at least a better version, from moving from scarcity to abundance also.
Yeah, there's I call the Monsters Inc. argument for basic income, which is it's one of the essays that I've written, where anyone who is familiar with Monsters Inc., the world of the monsters was fueled by fear. And you're trying to get the screams, you're harvesting screams from kids, and I feel that's basically the way our world is set up. And then at the end of the movie, they learn that actually there's an even better power source, and that's actually the joy and laughter of kids, and they just never thought to use that. So I think that not only can we make things less bad than things are, but we'd actually make things a lot better. And I think that basic income really creates that better world where we're actually fueled by joy and laughter and meaning and well-being and happiness, instead of what we're doing right now.
Yeah,
How far away do you think we are from actually making this happen on a large scale?
I mean, I think anything can happen thanks to technology. Like if it weren't for AI, like I would be much more pessimistic. Just because there's just been nothing. Like poverty has existed, insecurity has existed, wages have been stagnant for decades. Like nothing kind of breaks people out of this just world hypothesis where you deserve to be in poverty because you made bad decisions, and we shouldn't like upset the structure, we shouldn't trust people. there's just nothing that breaks out of that. Or technology, I think, changes that. If people feel that they could actually lose their jobs, that their jobs could be automated, and how that would upturn their lives, then they're going to be more open to changing the system so that they actually get money without any conditions, that's always there, because they need that security. And we're going to see, I think, some interesting times ahead as AI continues to achieve more advances, be able to be more effective, to do more things, and is actually even just propagated throughout the system. Like, even existing AI right now, it's just not being used by everybody. But as soon as it's actually made usable and it's spread through all the corporations, and people are actually using this for higher productivity, then we're going to see bigger changes. And I think those changes are going to be what finally drives people to consider, what's the way to design a 21st century kind of safety net? What does that look like? And I think basic income is going to be a key part of that discussion, and hopefully we can win it. And I think that whatever country does it first, I would like the US to do it. I wish that we still had like the same pride as we did, like when we landed men on the moon, as far as being like the first to do some pioneering accomplishment. But maybe some other country will be first. And whatever that country is, I think that other countries will look at that and say, well, things are going pretty well with that. Maybe we should do that here too. So I think that once it takes hold somewhere, that I think we'll see it more. And hopefully that'll be the case. And hopefully the US is not going to be like we are with universal healthcare, as being like the last ones to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's truly an idea whose time has come soon.
Hopefully.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Scott. People can go to your website, scottsantens.com. Just read more, and because you're a wealth of resources on your website, wealth of information, so much. So thank you for all the work you've done on this subject.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the invite. Always happy to talk about it.
Yeah.
We got to talk about it a lot to get these ideas out in the collective.
Yeah. I mean, I always encourage everyone, if they have some kind of network that they can, create content and propagate through and talk to people with, like, that's what we need. We just need a lot more discussion and knowledge and information.
And there's been a lot of appreciation in the chat too.
Yeah.
Great.
Well, thank you. And
thank you so much. And thank you all for listening.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. We'll talk again. Bye.